According to several confidential dispatches reviewed by independent analysts, the first signs of the Crimean fuel shutdown appeared weeks before the public even noticed. It began quietly: a delay in shipments from the mainland, an unexplained pause in refinery schedules, a handful of trucks turned back at inspection points without reason. Local media called it logistical turbulence. Officials repeated the same phrase with rehearsed ease. But beneath that calm, inside restricted government channels, the words were different. They called it the containment protocol. For years, the peninsula had been fragile but functional, dependent, yet self-assured, surviving on the steady rhythm of deliveries from elsewhere. Then, almost overnight, the rhythm stopped. Gas stations went dark. Pumps sealed. The digital payment systems attached to them flickered out, one by one. Within 24 hours, queues stretched for miles, silent, motionless, desperate. No one shouted. People simply waited, as if waiting itself could summon fuel back into existence. By dawn, the peninsula was still. The highways lay empty, the cities eerily quiet. Engines slept, ferries stood moored, and even the wind seemed to move slower, dragging through a haze of disbelief. This was not an explosion, not a natural disaster, it was an engineered stillness. And the strangest part was how clean it felt. No debris, no violence, just the sudden absence of motion. According to internal reports leaked from regional administrations, all official fuel reserves had been redirected for strategic purposes. The phrase, sterile and bureaucratic, concealed more than it revealed. Strategic for whom? For what? No one outside the upper energy committees could say. Local authorities, instructed to maintain confidence, repeated the same script across the peninsula: temporary technical complications. Normal supply will resume shortly. But even as they spoke, everyone understood, nothing about this was temporary. Satellite data showed a dramatic drop in tanker activity toward the peninsula starting 10 days before the crisis was acknowledged. The fuel didn't vanish, it was withheld. Somewhere along the chain, the decision had been made to turn the valve, to watch what would happen if the peninsula was cut off, not by blockade, but by silence. Inside Crimea, the effects spread with eerie symmetry. First, the cars stopped. Then the buses. Then the tractors, the fishing boats, the generators. Within 72 hours, entire towns began to ration movement as if motion itself had become currency. Those who still had a few liters left treated it like gold, stored in hidden canisters, measured by drops, guarded more fiercely than cash. Fuel became a new kind of truth, scarce, untraceable, and whispered about. Our sources inside the Crimean logistical networks describe a strange calm among mid-level officials. They spoke of monitoring resilience, of observing behavioral adaptation. It was as if the shutdown was not an accident but a study, a live experiment in deprivation. The question was no longer whether people could survive without fuel, but how they would behave when movement was taken from them. "We are testing elasticity," one insider wrote in a private message intercepted by analysts. "How long can the system hold still before it breaks itself?" In that sentence lies the entire anatomy of the shutdown. It was never about gasoline. It was about control. About teaching a population what dependency feels like when the supply lines tighten. The lesson was delivered not with force, but with precision: no violence, no chaos, just absence. A silence more powerful than any weapon. At night, the peninsula changed character. Without engines, without the hum of transport, the dark carried further. Conversations in courtyards echoed, footsteps sounded sharper, the wind cut deeper. People spoke softly, not out of fear of punishment, but out of awe. Something immense and invisible was happening, and everyone could feel it pressing against the edges of their small routines. The shutdown was not just physical, it was psychological. It replaced motion with thought. Across the border, official channels maintained the illusion of routine. Moscow called the situation manageable, promising that deliveries would resume in due course. But the phrasing was too familiar, too polished. In due course is the language of permanence disguised as delay. And inside Crimea, even the most loyal citizens began to sense the shift. They had lived through shortages before, but never one so absolute, so deliberate, so quiet. By the end of the first week, the peninsula's geography itself began to change meaning. Roads became lines of memory, not transit. Gas stations became monuments, glowing in the dark with useless light, their digital signs still showing prices for a commodity that no longer existed. The infrastructure of modernity remained perfectly intact, mocking the people who could no longer use it. That was the cruelty of the shutdown: it didn't destroy, it withheld. Confidential energy sector briefings describe the event as the controlled immobilization of a dependent region. Its purpose, the documents suggest, was not punishment but calibration, an exercise in testing the limits of endurance. How does a modern society behave when stripped of movement? Does it riot? Does it adapt? Does it learn obedience through stillness? Those questions, once theoretical, were now being answered in real time. In the streets, fear turned to ritual. People began walking long distances to work, carrying bicycles through empty intersections, trading goods for rides from those who still had fuel left. Markets reorganized around motion. Everything revolved around movement. Who could offer it, who could buy it, who could fake it? Entire microeconomies bloomed and died within days, each built on rumor and scarcity. Yet through it all, one detail remained unchanged: the silence. No protests, no public outrage, no speeches. Just the quiet endurance of people who had seen too many crises to expect rescue. They knew the script by heart: denial, delay, adaptation, silence. This was the rhythm of survival in a place where dependency had become culture. Experts monitoring social networks reported an odd emotional pattern: not anger, but fatigue. Outrage requires energy, exhaustion does not. People didn't post demands, they posted schedules, advice, improvised solutions. The shutdown had converted frustration into function. Even despair had a timetable. Inside the peninsula's administrative command centers, officials continued issuing identical statements: the situation is under control. But those who read between the lines noticed the shift. Control no longer meant governance. It meant containment. The shutdown had succeeded, not as failure, but as proof that a population could be immobilized without rebellion. As night fell again across the peninsula, the silence deepened. In the absence of motion, even time seemed slower, thicker, distorted. For the first time in years, Crimea had no sound of engines, no distant roar of life, only the wind and the low electric hum of cities pretending to be awake. Somewhere beyond that hum, decisions were still being made. Someone, somewhere, was still watching. And this, perhaps, is the most chilling realization: that stillness is not peace. It's surveillance. The shutdown is not over, it has only entered its quietest phase, the phase where fear becomes routine, and routine becomes obedience. Stay with us, this is only the beginning of the silence. Subscribe, because when movement returns, it will not mean freedom. It will mean the test is complete. By the second week, the stillness on the peninsula had turned from inconvenience into architecture. What began as a shortage now felt like design. Streets once mapped by movement had become corridors of waiting. The peninsula no longer pulsed, it hovered, suspended in a strange, obedient calm. Official broadcasts continued to repeat the same lines: supplies are being restored, logistics are stabilizing. But the words no longer sounded like reassurance. They sounded like code. In the inner offices of local administrations, the language had changed entirely. According to restricted memoranda obtained from mid-level coordinators, the phrase now circulating among officials was passive stabilization. It referred to a policy that prioritized perception over resolution, a strategy to keep the population quiet until the narrative caught up with reality. The goal was not to fix the shortage. The goal was to teach people to live inside it. Our contacts within the Ministry of Energy describe an atmosphere of deliberate confusion. Orders contradicted each other. One directive authorized immediate redistribution of reserves, another suspended it. Managers were told to expect fuel deliveries that never came, and when they asked why, they were reminded to maintain composure. The paralysis was administrative, but also psychological. No one wanted to move without instruction, and no instruction ever came. The shutdown had become self-sustaining. Inside the peninsula's towns, reality adapted to the new rhythm. Movement ceased to be a right, it became privilege. Government vehicles moved under escort, their tanks filled from secret reserves guarded by silent soldiers. Ambulances and emergency units operated only within narrow perimeters, and even they began rationing their fuel. Entire neighborhoods started creating informal mobility networks, families pooling what little gasoline they had, timing errands around whispers of delivery trucks that might appear. The entire social structure reoriented around motion. Those who could still move became currency. At night, the highways stood empty, illuminated by lights that served no purpose. Cameras recorded nothing but silence. It was a landscape drained of urgency, as if the land itself had stopped breathing. Sociologists studying the event later described it as engineered inertia. A condition where the absence of movement becomes so total that it reshapes human behavior. People walk differently, speak slower, think in smaller steps. Society contracts until it fits inside the limits of its own stillness. From Moscow came the same routine denials: temporary, manageable, under control. But within the alliance of insiders who monitored the peninsula's data flow, a different interpretation emerged. The shutdown was being used as a diagnostic, a stress test for the social and logistical systems that bind the region to the mainland. By cutting the flow of energy, the authorities could observe which networks broke first, which towns panicked, which remained loyal, which adapted. It was not a crisis to be solved, it was an experiment to be measured. One document, marked for internal analytical review, defined the purpose explicitly: to assess societal cohesion under conditions of resource withdrawal. In other words, obedience through absence. How much deprivation could the population tolerate before dissent outweighed fatigue? The shutdown would answer that question without firing a single shot. The public, of course, knew none of this. They saw only empty pumps, silent roads, and the growing absurdity of official optimism. Television presenters smiled through reports of successful logistical realignment, while behind them, images of deserted stations flickered on the screen. It was the most delicate form of manipulation, one that did not deny the crisis, but diluted it into routine. If people see the same lie often enough, it becomes less a falsehood than a habit. According to data leaked from telecommunications providers, online discussions about the shutdown were quietly filtered. Certain phrases, fuel blockade, logistical isolation, energy containment, disappeared from social media feeds within hours of posting. What remained were smaller words, less dangerous ones: shortage, delay, waiting. The vocabulary of helplessness replaced the vocabulary of defiance. And with language subdued, anger lost its grammar. Meanwhile, the bureaucratic machinery of the peninsula kept humming: meetings, reports, signatures, all beautifully pointless. Local administrators filed daily updates about progress in restoration, though no progress occurred. Each report served the same purpose: to produce the illusion of control. Control itself had become an aesthetic, a ritual performance staged for the benefit of those above. And the more useless the reports became, the more of them were written. It was the bureaucratic equivalent of praying to a god who no longer listens. The human consequences deepened. In towns where buses stopped running, schools shortened their hours. Factories reduced shifts. Hospitals limited patient transport. Everything shrank inward. Families clustered together, sharing what little remained: food, warmth, motion. The shutdown had stripped away the illusion of independence. People realized how much of life depended on invisible systems they never thought about: pipelines, depots, supply chains. All of it gone, switched off by someone they would never meet. A low-level energy official who later fled the region described the experience as living inside a paused documentary. The buildings were intact, the infrastructure untouched, yet time refused to move forward. "We were ghosts inside our own cities," he said. "We watched life from a distance, through the glass of our windows." Economists outside the region began noticing ripple effects in surrounding areas, minor, but measurable. Freight routes slowed. Prices of fuel derivatives fluctuated. Insurance companies quietly reclassified the peninsula as a non-standard risk zone. No one spoke of embargoes, no one used the word sanctions. The beauty of the shutdown was its invisibility. No international law had been broken. It was a crisis without an aggressor, and therefore, without remedy. The peninsula's media landscape adjusted to the new paradigm. Morning shows introduced segments titled "Life Without Hurry," presenting stories of creative adaptation, people walking to work, communities planting gardens, families discovering simplicity. The propaganda was subtle and seductive, deprivation reframed as virtue. It didn't tell people to stop complaining. It told them they were brave for enduring. And in that twisted admiration lay the foundation of compliance. Inside private conversations, however, a different narrative brewed. Truck drivers stranded for weeks shared food and fuel among themselves, forming small, self-sustaining networks. Mechanics repurposed engines to run on alcohol or stolen reserves. Fishermen built makeshift pumps powered by wind and gravity. These were not acts of rebellion, not yet. They were acts of survival. But every small adaptation carried the seed of independence. The same control that sought to immobilize the peninsula was teaching its people how to move without permission. By the third week, it was clear even to the most loyal administrators that this was no longer a logistical problem. It was an experiment in obedience. But by then, the machine was running itself. No one dared stop it. To reverse the shutdown would mean acknowledging that it had a beginning, and that someone had ordered it. So the silence continued, efficient and immaculate. Late at night, when generators flickered in government offices, the few who still had access to real-time data watched the graphs in disbelief. The peninsula's fuel consumption line had dropped to almost zero. The system was still functioning, electricity stable, communications intact, but the pulse of transport, the blood of everyday life, had flatlined. It was not collapse. It was control perfected. And somewhere, in a secure office far from the silence of the peninsula, the numbers were being analyzed. Charts printed. Trends extrapolated. The data would soon tell them exactly how long a modern society could hold its breath. The shutdown had begun as an accident, at least that's what the public was told. But now, in the corridors of power, it was being studied as a model. A model that might soon be tested again. And perhaps that's why, even now, the pumps remain sealed, not for lack of fuel, but because silence has become more useful than supply. Because in this new era, control isn't measured by how much power you have. It's measured by how much motion you can stop. And Crimea has stopped completely. By the third month of the shutdown, the stillness no longer frightened anyone. It had become the landscape itself, a constant, heavy presence that pressed against the air like gravity. The roads were no longer places of transit, but corridors of memory. Gas stations stood like abandoned temples, their glass unbroken, their pumps polished by wind, their price boards still glowing with numbers that no longer meant anything. The peninsula had entered a phase the insiders now called sustainable immobility. A phrase designed to sound technical, but which really meant surrender. In the early days, people had waited. They lined up their cars for hours, expecting deliveries that never came. Then they adapted. The waiting lines became meeting places, the rumor of fuel, a currency. Entire neighborhoods organized around whispers, who still had reserves, who could barter a liter, who might have siphoned a hidden cache before the valves were sealed. The economy didn't collapse, it mutated. Fuel became information. Information became survival. Government broadcasts continued to describe the situation as transitional, a word repeated so often that it began to lose meaning. Transitional from what, to what? No one could say. Local journalists who tried to investigate were told to avoid speculative tone. The press releases arrived daily, identical to the last, the situation remained stable. It was true, in a way. Stability is just another name for paralysis. Sociologists later called this period the normalization of absence. The population had learned to live without what it once considered essential. They walked. They carried. They shared. Workplaces staggered hours to minimize travel, hospitals paired patients by district to limit transport, even weddings were rescheduled according to fuel availability. Society contracted into smaller circles, tighter routines, slower rhythms. And yet, somehow, life went on, quieter, thinner, drained of spontaneity. It was survival reduced to mathematics. Inside the administrative command centers, the numbers told their own story. Consumption down by 93%. Vehicle traffic reduced to pre-industrial levels. Black market transactions rising in perfect symmetry with official scarcity. In economic terms, the system was efficient, no waste, no excess, no chaos. Every leader accounted for, every movement traceable. The shutdown had achieved what no decree ever could, total visibility. A society immobilized was a society fully known. Our sources within local energy agencies describe the mood as quiet awe. Even those tasked with managing the crisis had begun to admire its elegance. It's perfect, one anonymous official wrote in a restricted chat later obtained by analysts. No protests, no looting, no panic. Just adaptation. The shutdown had revealed something that terrified and fascinated those in power, that people will accept almost anything if it comes without noise. But the silence was not empty. Beneath it, small resistances formed, delicate, invisible, growing like roots under concrete. Farmers began distilling makeshift biofuel in barns. Mechanics learned to convert engines to run on alcohol and gas fumes. Fishermen traded kerosene for cigarettes and favors. These were not acts of rebellion, they were acts of defiance disguised as necessity. The state called it illegal trade. In truth, it was life reasserting itself in the spaces the system had forgotten. By midwinter, the peninsula's cities had developed their own etiquette of deprivation. People no longer asked when fuel would return. They asked how much it would cost when it did, and who would be allowed to buy it. Movement had become stratified. The powerful still drove. The officials still commuted. The rest watched their taillights fade into the distance and said nothing. Psychologists observing the situation described a phenomenon they called collective deceleration. It meant that when motion disappears, even thought slows. Decisions take longer, emotions flatten, and people begin to measure their lives not by progress, but by endurance. Crimea had entered that stage completely. Life was not lived forward anymore. It was sustained sideways. In this suspended existence, propaganda evolved. The state no longer promised abundance, it praised stillness. Crimea remains calm, said the news anchors, their voices smooth and low. Crimea remains patient. Crimea remains strong. The message was clear, survival itself was victory. Deprivation, once shameful, had been reframed as moral superiority. We endure, therefore we prevail. It was the perfect anesthetic, obedience disguised as dignity. Yet cracks began to show. In coastal towns, the black market became bolder. Drivers with smuggled fuel moved only at night, guided by rumors of patrol routes and sympathetic guards. In the villages, cooperative networks formed, small groups pooling money to purchase contraband fuel from distant regions. These operations were fragile, but effective. The authorities, though aware of them, did not intervene. Contained defiance, after all, was better than open rage. The system needed the illusion of release, a valve for frustration. Controlled disobedience became part of the plan. Behind the scenes, however, the data told a different story. Internal analytics compiled by the Federal Monitoring Bureau showed a decline not only in consumption, but in trust. Surveys conducted quietly, through intermediaries, revealed that 67% of respondents no longer believed the shortage was accidental. They didn't know the cause, but they understood one thing instinctively: it had been done to them, not around them. That awareness was dangerous. Awareness, unlike anger, doesn't fade. It waits. Economists within the Kremlin's advisory circles began referring to Crimea as a containment model. In closed presentations, they described it as a case study in adaptive obedience. The peninsula had proven something profound, that modern populations, when isolated, do not revolt, they adjust. It was a revelation too useful to ignore. Other regions, they said quietly, could one day benefit from similar resilience testing. The term spread through internal documents like an infection. Resilience testing, an elegant euphemism for deprivation. In the cities, whispers turned to folklore. The fuel isn't gone, people would say. They're keeping it somewhere. Stories circulated of underground depots, of convoys traveling at night, of ships unloading barrels under fog. Most of these stories were lies, but some were true. A few tankers had indeed arrived, only to unload their cargo into restricted storage sites. The fuel was there, just not for them. The system had learned to weaponize access. Still, there were moments of fragile beauty amid the stillness. With fewer cars, the air cleared. The nights grew darker, the stars sharper. Families gathered outside, wrapped in blankets, talking again, not because they wanted to, but because there was nothing else to do. Time slowed, and in its widening silence, something unexpected took root: thought. People began to ask questions, not out loud, not yet, but quietly, to themselves. How much of life depends on permission? How much control do we truly have? And what happens if they never turn the flow back on? In a leaked transcript from a closed academic seminar, one policy advisor summed it up with chilling precision: the shutdown has revealed a truth we cannot unlearn, that silence is the most efficient form of governance. That sentence circulated quietly across ministries, quoted, analyzed, admired. It became the intellectual justification for something much larger, a new form of authority based not on orders, but on absence. By spring, Crimea had become both laboratory and metaphor. A place where stillness was not failure, but proof that control could be achieved without force, and that obedience could survive without belief. The peninsula was calm, yes. But calm is just another word for waiting. And waiting, as every strategist knows, is the most disciplined form of fear. These are the moments few notice, the months between crisis and consequence, the spaces where silence learns to speak. Stay with us, because what comes next won't begin with sound. It will begin with motion, and by the time it moves, it will already be too late. Subscribe, before the silence ends. By the time the first fuel trucks finally reappeared on the horizon, no one cheered. Their engines, once symbols of restoration, now sounded intrusive, like noise intruding upon a ritual. People watched them pass in silence, faces expressionless, as if witnessing something they had already rehearsed in their minds. After months of stillness, motion no longer meant freedom. It meant surveillance. It meant the experiment was over, and its results had been recorded. According to internal memoranda reviewed by several energy consultants, the reconnection protocol had been planned for weeks. It was never a spontaneous recovery. It was a scheduled reanimation, the precise moment when deprivation had accomplished its purpose and stability could be reintroduced without losing control. The goal was not to restore normal life, but to redefine it. The new normal would not resemble the old one. It would function under rules that had been quietly rewritten during the months of silence. In the early days after the flow resumed, everything seemed the same: cars refueled, buses returned to routes, generators hummed again. But nothing truly returned. People moved more slowly, spoke more carefully, avoided crowds. Even laughter felt subdued, as if joy required permission. The sound of engines, once a sign of energy, now reminded them how fragile it all was, how easily the world could be paused again. The shutdown had left an imprint not on infrastructure, but on the psyche. The population had learned its lesson: mobility is conditional. Inside the ministries, officials celebrated the operation as a triumph of strategic endurance. The peninsula had remained stable, loyal, compliant. Reports praised the efficiency of the containment model and recommended that its principles be studied for future application. Analysts called it a success in behavioral engineering. It was the kind of success that leaves scars instead of medals. Economists dissected the data, tracing patterns of adaptation: decreased consumption, increased local cooperation, heightened self-regulation. What they saw as metrics were, in truth, the marks of human submission. The peninsula had not survived because of resilience, it had survived because it had learned to obey silence. In every graph, in every report, the same line appeared: public composure maintained. A phrase that hides the simplest and most terrifying fact: people did not resist. But while the surface returned to order, beneath it something had changed, subtly, irreversibly. Those who had endured the shutdown no longer believed in promises. They no longer trusted broadcasts, schedules, or explanations. The shutdown had taught them to expect nothing and to rely on no one. That cynicism, invisible but corrosive, spread faster than any rebellion. It was not defiance. It was detachment, the quiet refusal to believe in the system that governs you. Our sources within the federal administration describe internal unease. Some officials feared that the shutdown had been too successful. By demonstrating how easily a region could be immobilized, the state had also demonstrated how vulnerable its trust network had become. Obedience had been achieved, yes, but at the cost of belief. And belief, once gone, cannot be manufactured. It can only be managed. From an analytical standpoint, Crimea had become the blueprint of a new paradigm, a prototype for governance through controlled dysfunction. Power no longer required persuasion or punishment. It only required the ability to stop motion. Every system, fuel, data, trade, communication, could be turned into a switch. On, off. Supply, pause. Reward, deprivation. It was governance as circuitry, predictable, impersonal, absolute. In one closed session of the State Council, an advisor reportedly summarized it in a single sentence: the future of control is interruption. The phrase was repeated, admired, and finally adopted as doctrine. Interruption was not failure, it was calibration. A way to remind societies that movement depends on permission. That even the illusion of independence is temporary. And so, while the world outside forgot the crisis, the blueprint spread. Minor fuel adjustments were tested in other regions. Communication blackouts conducted in the name of security. Each incident presented as an isolated malfunction. Each, in truth, part of a new vocabulary of power. The shutdown had evolved from a single event into a philosophy, one that ruled through rhythm, through silence, through the manipulation of expectation. Within Crimea, people adjusted. They moved again, but without urgency. They planned without belief. Gas stations reopened, but drivers filled only what they needed, keeping their tanks half empty, as if expecting another pause. Families stocked small reserves, hidden in sheds, in basements, behind false walls. Preparedness became superstition. Everyone knew, without being told, that what had happened once could happen again. The memory of stillness had rewritten behavior. In villages, the older generation spoke of the shutdown with grim humor. We lived through the silence, they said. Now we live with it. For the young, who had grown up in motion, the memory was stranger, a ghost story told by exhausted parents, a reminder that the world could disappear overnight. Schools began teaching resilience modules, framed as civic education. They were lessons in endurance disguised as patriotism. Psychologists sent to study the aftermath found a population remarkably stable, yet emotionally muted. The shutdown had turned anxiety into discipline. Fear into etiquette. They called it collective learned composure. It sounded benign, even noble. But what it really described was the institutionalization of fear, a transformation of panic into obedience so deep it no longer felt external. Control had moved inside the mind. Meanwhile, the data kept flowing. Energy ministries reported improved efficiency, reduced waste, stronger compliance metrics. International observers noted a paradox: the region's productivity was rising even as its freedom contracted. Economists called it the efficiency of containment. Historians, years later, would call it by its true name, the economy of obedience. In the months that followed, a strange quiet settled over the peninsula. The hum of engines returned, the shops reopened, but a sense of hollowness persisted. People moved, but their motion lacked conviction. Conversations lingered longer, but only in whispers. The silence that once terrified them had become a habit, an invisible rhythm that dictated how loud one could live. The shutdown had outlasted itself. Even with fuel restored, the immobility remained, not in the streets, but in the soul. And yet, somewhere beneath that silence, something faint and dangerous was forming. A different kind of awareness, not rebellion, not outrage, but recognition. The realization that silence could be studied, and therefore undone. That even controlled systems depend on faith. And that one day, someone would forget to be afraid. For now, though, the peninsula sleeps. The night roads stretch empty and clean, the stations glow softly in their renewed purpose, and the engines murmur like lullabies. But those who listen closely can still hear the ghost of the shutdown, the echo of a world that learned to stop. The crisis has been archived. The data analyzed. The silence perfected. And yet, the question remains, whispered in corridors, written in notebooks never sent: if motion can be turned off once, who decides when it turns off again? And what happens when the silence no longer obeys? Until that answer surfaces, Crimea will continue as it is now, quiet, functional, fragile. The prototype of a future that has already begun. Stay with us, these chronicles are not history yet. They are instructions. Subscribe now, while the lights are still on, because when the next shutdown comes, the story may begin again, and this time, no one will even call it a crisis.